Yharnam is the home of blood ministration. You need only unravel its mystery. But where's an outsider like yourself to begin? Easy, with a bit of Yharnam blood of your own. But first, you'll need a contract.
The Souls series of games have been fascinating beasts to watch emerge into the mainstream. Following in the vein of character action games like Devil May Cry, with an intense focus on positioning, yet slowing the gameplay down to a pace closer to the Elder Scrolls, it's created an amazing survival experience. It's captured the hearts and memes of many a player, and challenged the perceptions of what a Japanese role-playing game can be. It's a wonderful series that shows exactly how to implement challenge and learn from defeat. It's a game that, through all of its difficulty and pain, wants you to succeed. Except for Bloodborne. Bloodborne doesn't know what it wants out of you. A Souls game in a Victorian and Gothic-inspired universe, Bloodborne is a great experience as your second or third Souls game. Once you have a firm grasp on the controls and get past the starting area, Bloodborne is consistent in its approach, tough as nails, but empowering the player to overcome the odds with aggressive play. Unfortunately, the beasts wandering central Yharnam discourage the player as often as they motivate them to continue forward, creating an ultimately frustrating inconsistency. Bloodborne starts promisingly enough. You're woken by Geppetto from Shadow Hearts 2 cosplaying as the Undertaker, get eaten by creepy little children heads, and learn the basic controls of the games from messages on the ground. You're then pit against a werewolf with nothing but your bare hands to fight it off. Have fun. Many players, especially new players, will die to this first obstacle, and Bloodborne does an excellent job of making you feel powerless against the much stronger and faster werewolf, while still making the encounter potentially beatable with patience and understanding. So you die and get a magical transforming steampunk weapon, and can fight the werewolf again. Now, while this encounter is much easier with your cool new range and power advantage, it's still entirely possible to lose. Bloodborne makes the player feel like they're getting on by the skin of their teeth, and it's an incredible sensation. It's a shame that this sense of resolve quickly shifts to a feeling of hopelessness after reaching the first lantern. The first bit of Central Yharnam is alright. This enemy bursting from crates teaches you that enemies can ambush you, and these two isolated guys on top of this stairwell are easy pickings, as one's very defensive with his shield while the other slowly gets up and lets you handle the two one at a time. Unfortunately, lurking down the stairwell are packs of roaming enemies, some of which carry torches. No matter what weapon or build you choose going into the game, the torch will always be quicker than the players. While it does teach a player to avoid conflict with groups of enemies and lure a single one out at a time, it does so in a punishing way that players can't properly adapt to. Heading into a group of enemies also stunlocks players, giving enemies ample time to hit them. While the pack that begins at the bottom of the stairwell does move onward, the player has no idea how far they'll roam before turning around, making getting through them either a process of trial and error, or a time to spam healing blood vials for a newbie. Bloodborne then has this corpse placed as a decoy, trying to teach the player that every corpse has to be checked, or it could come back to bite you. Quite literally in some cases. Unfortunately, because this enemy has a rifle, it doesn't directly chase after the player when triggered, instead getting into range and lining up a shot. This makes this corpse trap indistinguishable from one of the roaming mobs, as there's no less than 3 mini patrols going out at one time. Until a player specifically notices that corpse coming up, they'd have no idea and no warning of the beware of corpses idea that Bloodborne's trying to teach. and would likely only grow frustrated that these cheap mobs have rifles now in addition to those torch guys. It's the following fire pit, though, that proves to be the greatest failing of Yharnam. At first, it seems to be something of a puzzle. There's a ton of guys celebrating roasting corpses, so you should find the path of least resistance without aggravating the horde. The path closest to the player hooks around to the right. The player aggroes 2 of the beasts from the major horde to come out, kills an unsuspecting gunman, and reaches a dead end. Alright, so the right side doesn't work. How's the player get to the open gate on the left side? Directly through the horde. Though a player can attempt to pick off individual enemies with their pistol and lure them to a bludgeony death, there are patrols specific to this area around the fire pit that can sneak up on a player, or worse, cause a player to miss a shot and bring the horde upon themselves. Players also can't simply use area of effect attacks either, because another Undertaker cosplayer is sitting on top of an inaccessible stagecoach to take pot shots at them and interrupt their animations. And approaching this stagecoach spawns an angry dog that has faster movement speed than the player, so running is impossible unless you already know it's coming. The entire ordeal is an absolute mess that can only be seen through by slowly eliminating threats, memorizing enemy patrol routes beforehand, and smartly knowing when to attack, shoot, or use healing items. Or you just run through the giant mob of enemies and roll occasionally until you run far enough that their AI decides not to chase you anymore. I don't think I need to explain why that's unintuitive. After the player's first great test, a checkpoint would really be appreciated, but Bloodborne just throws more level at you instead. While I understand that the distance crossed by the player to this point is essentially just one large hallway, a new player struggling through deserves a bit of a break to catch their footing. The next area has these creepy crows that can combo a player to death, but they're also largely immobile, so they shouldn't be a problem except for the particularly careless. It also has this troll with a brick, and Brick Troll actually does a pretty great job on teaching the game's form of parrying. The player waits for the obvious tell of the brick to come down, shoots the troll in the face, and stabs for a visceral strike. I would like there to be any indication that shooting someone in the face to stun them is the gateway to the critical hit mechanic, but it's a fair thing for the player to learn. Good practice, and the troll always drops blood vials to heal up with. The next area features a small group with 3 dogs and 3 human enemies. While the enemies having the high ground here makes it difficult to hit them, it's a far more effective test than the bonfire at singling out targets and taking them down 1 or 2 at a time. It's a good way to build the player's confidence back up after a difficult challenge. Only for it to be shot down immediately once they ascend to this bridge. Though there is a side path toward the back, the path is winding and loops back in on itself, so the player is funneled toward the bridge. Here the player is tasked with 2, count 'em, 2 werewolves blocking the path. Trying to aggro one away is an exercise in futility, as their paths often collide with each other and both can only be encountered from the same linear point. A player may think they've gotten stronger and will be able to dispatch the werewolves quickly based on how few swings it took to take out the werewolf at the start. But nope! These 2 are inexplicably far more durable than the first. The odds of a player dying here are massive, and these dogs serve as an even greater roadblock than the fire pit. Unless, of course, you decide to just ignore them and run right in between the werewolves, like a reasonable person. Cowardice is its own reward. After pushing through the wolves, the player reaches a choice: continue on the bridge, or go to side paths on the left or right. The game tries to funnel you forward with this clock tower set piece, potentially offering safety after just one more of these brick trolls. You get closer to the gates and...
Cleric Beast.
The Cleric Beast is a massive leap in difficulty to anything the player has encountered before. And while it has its fair share of weaknesses, it's not something an unleveled, untrained player who just got through what seemed like a strong enough challenge in the werewolves will be prepared for. And when you die, it sends you right back to the lantern. Do it all again, buddy. Perhaps the player will take a different path next time in order to better prepare for the beast, but without proper forewarning, the beast is likely to claim their head at least once before the player can actually save their progress. To the right is a kennel filled with dog enemies and a further progression of Central Yharnam, with nary a checkpoint in sight. To the left is a house filled with relatively weak enemies, but introducing a new one in a form of this man in a wheelchair with a hand cannon. And then, mercifully, a loop back up to the checkpoint the player started at opens, allowing for easy access just past the werewolves for the player to continue on. Though the twin wolves serve as the last major obstacle for a player to finally save their progress, the fact that this checkpoint is gated by having to choose the right path out of 3 options is absolutely ludicrous after all the player has had to endure up to this point. This is made even worse if the player decided to run from the werewolves instead of kill them, as weighing the pros and cons of 3 arbitrary paths generally isn't something a person thinks about when running for their lives from werewolves. To the game's credit, it is very generous with item drops. Molotov cocktails, which are fantastic for dealing with enemy groups and werewolves alike, are plentiful, and it's very easy to stockpile up on multiple blood vials for consistent healing. That is, for your first run-through of the area. Items do not respawn after you collect them, and Bloodborne lacks recoverable healing items at checkpoints like Dark Souls' Estus Flask retrieval system. If a new player dies after using any of these items up, they're out of luck. Outside of a single vial given to you by backtracking to the player's spawn room and 2 from the Brick Troll, there are no reliable drops of blood vials or Molotovs. The player simply has to hope that the roaming mobs drop vials. Grinding, in other words. This is unintuitive to say the least, as the player is kept at what is essentially level 1 during the whole ordeal. However, in traditional RPGs, grinding at least allows a player to enjoy small victories over weak enemies. Bloodborne has a finite number of enemies who can drop vials, meaning a player will have to die if they run out of enemies but want to grind further so they can endure the werewolves. Bloodborne at this point requires death to continue grinding properly. Add in the fact that Bloodborne's lack of a shield means the player can't easily turtle out these weaker encounters, and that one slip-up could lead to their doom, and Bloodborne feels like a game that does not want you to complete it. Now, I'm not saying that there's no place for a difficult tutorial or that unfairness can't be used effectively. Heck, we did an entire episode on that with Ghosts and Goblins. But Bloodborne is a different beast, with small elements of fair challenge spread out over a trial-and-error gauntlet. It's not even that Bloodborne is a bad game. On the contrary, going just a bit further, Father Gascoigne is one of the most engaging, fair, and fun bosses to kick off an action game. But while he's a difficult end to a journey through Central Yharnam, one to prepare for and learn from in quick bursts, the first sprint through is a protracted slog. Worse yet, the game can't seem to decide on exactly what it wants to teach. Is it better to take groups of enemies as more engaging one-on-ones, or run past them and see if you can abuse AI and the terrain to your advantage? Should I plan around mobs or ignore them? Is grinding worth my while or not? Is it better to just reset so I can get the initial item drops in a clean run? Or is perseverance its own reward? Bloodborne's answers to these questions and more are ultimately muddled by inconsistent design. Bloodborne can be an incredible experience, but the teaching tools it uses constantly shift between generous and good to ineffectual and punishing. A player cannot get good without proper motivation. Though the game's strengths materialize later on, its opening sprint only frustrates the player by proving how to design for inconsistency.